The wind howled through the narrow alley as the first drops of rain began to fall, splashing onto the cracked pavement. A teenage boy, just shy of 16, trudged home from his after-school job. His backpack, slung over one shoulder, was damp from the drizzle, and his sneakers squeaked with every step. He hated walking home this late, but the small paycheck helped his family make ends meet, and he didn't mind the quiet time to think. Tonight, however, something about the stillness felt different, almost eerie. As he neared an abandoned building that everyone in town avoided, he heard it. A faint whimper, barely audible over the sound of the rain. He froze, heart pounding, straining to hear it again. For a moment, there was nothing, just the sound of water dripping from the overhanging roof. Then, there it was, a weak, trembling cry that sent a chill down his spine. It wasn't human, but it was filled with so much pain and fear that it was impossible to ignore. Curiosity and concern pushed him forward, his footsteps tentative, as he approached the building's entrance. The whimpering grew louder, more desperate, and his stomach twisted at the thought of what might be inside. "Hello?" he called out, his voice cracking slightly. No response came, just another pitiful cry. It sounded like an animal, and he wondered if someone's pet had gotten stuck. His hand hesitated on the rusted metal door before he pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. Inside, the air was damp and musty, the dim light from a flickering street lamp outside casting long shadows across the room. Broken furniture and shards of glass littered the floor, and the boy stepped carefully, trying not to make too much noise. In the corner, he spotted a cardboard box, and the sound was coming from there. He moved closer, heart racing, and what he saw made his breath catch. A small dog, barely more than a puppy, cowered in the box. Its fur was matted and filthy, its ribs visible beneath the thin layer of skin. The dog's eyes were wide with terror, and it flinched at every movement the boy made. But what really made his blood boil was the thick rope tied tightly around its neck, cutting into its flesh, and the bruises and cuts on its body that told a story of unimaginable cruelty. Someone had done this on purpose. The boy knelt down, his movements slow and deliberate, trying not to scare the dog any further. "It's okay," he whispered softly. "I'm not going to hurt you." He reached out his hand, palm open, but the dog shrank back, pressing itself into the corner of the box. The boy's throat tightened. Who could do this to a creature so small and helpless? He stayed there for what felt like hours, whispering calming words and letting the dog get used to his presence. Finally, the dog lifted its head slightly, its big, sorrowful eyes locking onto his. That single moment of trust was enough. Carefully, the boy pulled out a granola bar from his backpack, unwrapping it and breaking off a small piece. He placed it on the ground and backed away, giving the dog space. Hesitantly, it sniffed the food and began to eat, its movements slow and shaky. Just as the boy began to feel a glimmer of hope, a loud noise shattered the quiet, a harsh voice from outside yelling, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Someone was coming. The boy's heart jumped into his throat as he realized the voice sounded angry, and he had a sinking feeling it was the person responsible for the dog's condition. He glanced at the dog, who was now trembling uncontrollably, and made a split-second decision. He had to get them both out of there, but how? The footsteps were getting closer, and the boy knew time was running out. He scooped the dog up gently, careful not to hurt it further, and held it close to his chest. "Hang on," he whispered, more to himself than to the dog. The door creaked open behind him, and the boy spun around, his heart hammering in his chest. In the dim light, he could just make out the silhouette of a man, his posture tense, his voice a low growl. "What do you think you're doing?" the man demanded, his tone filled with menace. The boy's mind raced as he clutched the trembling dog tighter. He didn't know who this man was or what he might do, but one thing was certain: he wasn't leaving without the dog. The boy's heart raced as he stood frozen, the dog's soft whimpers barely audible in his arms. The man in the doorway was tall, his features barely visible in the shadows, but the menace in his voice was unmistakable. "That's my dog," the man spat, taking a step forward, his boots scraping against the floor. His breath was heavy, almost like a growl, and the boy could see the way his hands clenched into fists at his sides. The boy tightened his grip on the dog, feeling its trembling body against his chest. "I'm not going to let you hurt her anymore," the boy said, his voice low but firm. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the adrenaline that surged through him. He had no idea who this man was, but he knew one thing for sure: he wasn't leaving this place without the dog. The man laughed, the sound cold and harsh, like he found the whole situation amusing. "You think you can just waltz in here and take what's mine?" His voice was filled with mockery, but the boy could hear the underlying threat. The boy's breath caught in his throat. What had this man done to the dog? How long had she been suffering? "I'm not going to let you get away with it," the boy repeated, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. He had no plan, no backup, and no idea what would happen next. But he couldn't just stand there and do nothing. The man stepped forward again, his heavy footsteps echoing through the room, and the boy instinctively took a step back. The dog in his arms shifted, trying to wriggle free, sensing the danger that was now in the air. "If you want her so badly," the man sneered, "you'll have to go through me." The boy's mind raced. He couldn't fight this man. He was too big, too strong. But he couldn't just hand the dog back, not after seeing what had been done to her. The rope, the bruises, it was clear this man was capable of unspeakable cruelty. The boy knew if he didn't act quickly, the dog would suffer even worse. His eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, that could help him. But there was nothing, just broken furniture and piles of debris. His only choice was to keep the man talking, keep him distracted, long enough to figure out a way out. "Why are you doing this?" the boy asked, his voice cracking slightly. "What did she ever do to you?" The man's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, the boy thought he might strike out. But then the man just chuckled, a dark, almost empty sound that sent shivers down the boy's spine. "You wouldn't understand," the man said, his tone suddenly calm, almost too calm. "She's nothing but a worthless animal. I've had my fun with her, but now it's time for her to go." The boy's stomach churned at the words. What kind of person could speak about another living being like that? But he couldn't let his emotions take over. He needed to think, needed to find a way out. The door was still open, but the man was blocking it, and the boy couldn't risk running into the street without a plan. "I'll take her with me," the boy said, keeping his voice as steady as possible. "You can't keep her. You don't deserve her." For a moment, the man just stared at him, his eyes flicking from the boy to the dog in his arms. The tension in the room was thick, like the air was holding its breath. Then, with a sudden movement, the man lunged forward, grabbing the boy by the wrist with a strength that made the boy's breath catch in his throat. "Do you really think you can stop me?" the man hissed, his grip tightening. The boy winced in pain, but he didn't let go of the dog. The puppy was squirming now, trying to get free, but the boy kept it close, protecting it from the danger that was closing in around them. The boy's mind raced. He couldn't let this man take the dog back. He needed to get away, but the man's grip was like iron. There was no way he could break free with his strength alone. Desperation started to seep in. The boy's eyes darted around once more, searching for something, anything that could help. He caught sight of a broken piece of wood lying on the ground. It was small, but it could be enough. In one swift motion, he yanked his wrist free, grabbing the piece of wood and swinging it at the man's leg. The man grunted in surprise, but he didn't release his grip. The boy swung again, this time aiming for the man's head, but the man blocked the strike with his arm, knocking the wood from the boy's hand. For a moment, the boy thought it was over. He was out of options, out of time. But then, as if out of nowhere, the sound of sirens wailed in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. The man's expression shifted from anger to panic, and for a brief second, he hesitated. The boy didn't waste the opportunity. He shoved the man away with all his strength, and in that instant, the dog let out a terrified yelp. The man stumbled backward, his eyes wide with rage, but the boy didn't look back. He ran, heart pounding, holding the dog tight as he made his way out of the building and into the alleyway. The sound of sirens grew louder, closer, but he didn't dare stop to see if they were really coming for him. The cold air hit his face as he sprinted down the alley, his sneakers slipping slightly on the wet ground. His lungs burned, but he pushed himself harder, knowing he couldn't slow down, not now. The man was still back there, and the boy didn't know if the sirens had anything to do with him. But the most important thing was getting the dog to safety. He rounded a corner and stopped, gasping for breath. He didn't know where he was going, didn't know what the next step would be. But for the first time since he found the dog, he felt a flicker of hope. The dog was quiet now, its trembling body still in his arms. The boy looked down at her, his heart aching for everything she'd been through. He didn't know what had happened to her before he found her, or why she was abandoned in that building. But he knew he couldn't let her suffer any longer. He had to help her, no matter what it took. But just as he was about to continue down the alley, the unmistakable sound of footsteps reached his ears. The boy's blood ran cold. They were getting closer, too close. Who was it? Had the man somehow caught up to him? Or was it someone else? The boy's grip tightened on the dog, his thoughts racing. What should he do? He couldn't face whoever was coming, not in the state he was in. He needed to get somewhere safe, somewhere the dog could heal and he could figure out what to do next. But where? Suddenly, he heard a voice call out from the shadows. "Hey, are you okay?" The boy froze, the words cutting through the tension like a knife. The boy turned quickly, his heart leaping into his throat. The voice wasn't the man's, but that didn't mean he was out of danger. He squinted through the darkness, trying to make out the figure that had spoken. It was a girl, her face partially obscured by a hood, but the concern in her eyes was clear as she approached him slowly, her hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Are you okay?" she asked again, her voice soft but firm. She took another step toward him, but the boy instinctively stepped back, clutching the dog tighter. He didn't know who this girl was, but he didn't have time to explain everything. The man, the one who had hurt the dog, was still somewhere back there, and the boy could feel the heat of the chase still lingering in the air. "Stay back," he said, his voice shaky but resolute. The girl stopped immediately, her eyes widening with understanding. She glanced around nervously, her gaze flickering to the alley entrance where the sirens were now clearly audible, growing nearer by the second. "I'm not going to hurt you," she said quickly, her voice earnest. "I'm just trying to help. I saw you with the dog." The boy looked at her with suspicion. Who was she? Why was she helping him? But something in her tone, the sincerity in her eyes, made him hesitate. He didn't have much of a choice. He couldn't keep running forever, and the dog in his arms was still shaking, exhausted from everything it had been through. "I don't know who you are, but I need to get her somewhere safe," the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Please, I don't know what to do." The girl studied him for a moment, her face serious. "You're right to be scared. The man you're running from, he's bad news. I've seen him around before. He's dangerous." The boy's heart sank. He didn't know much about the man who had owned the dog, but now that he was hearing this from someone else, his fears only deepened. He had no idea how deep the man's cruelty went, or what lengths he might go to in order to get the dog back. "Who is he?" the boy asked, his voice barely audible. The girl hesitated before answering. He's He's a local. Someone no one wants to mess with. He runs a lot of shady deals in this neighborhood. I don't know all the details, but I've heard stories. He's been known to abuse animals before, especially strays like her. He probably won't give up until he gets her back. The boy felt his stomach twist. This wasn't just some random guy. This was someone with power, someone who had probably hurt others before. And the boy had just stolen from him. If he was going to protect this dog, he had to be smarter than ever. The girl continued, her voice lowering as she stepped closer. I know a place where you can hide. But we have to be quick. They'll come for her. And for you, too. The boy's mind raced. Hide? There was no hiding from someone like that. But what choice did he have? He had no idea how long it would take for the man to realize the dog was gone, but the sooner they got out of the area, the better. He glanced at the dog in his arms. She had stopped trembling, but her eyes were dull, exhausted from the ordeal. She needed care. She needed protection. Okay, the boy said, his voice barely a whisper. Take me to the place. But I won't leave her. Not again. The girl nodded, her face hardening with resolve. Don't worry. I'll make sure you're safe. She motioned for him to follow her, and without another word, they began to move quickly down the alley, their footsteps muffled by the rain. The boy kept his eyes on the path ahead, but his mind was racing, thoughts spinning faster than he could process. Who was this girl? How did she know about the man? What did she want from him? He had too many questions, but now was not the time to ask. His focus had to be on getting to safety. As they turned a corner, the girl glanced back at him, her expression tight with urgency. We don't have long, she said. He's probably already looking for you. You need to keep moving. The boy nodded, pushing all thoughts of the man from his mind, focusing only on the next step. The alleyways were dark, and the rain was coming down harder now, making it harder to see. But he kept his eyes trained on the girl's figure ahead of him, trusting her lead. They reached a narrow street, barely wide enough for two people to walk side by side, and the girl stopped. She looked around, her eyes scanning the surroundings before she nodded toward a small, inconspicuous building tucked between two larger shops. That's the place, she said. It's safe for now. It's one of my aunt's places. She runs a shelter for animal strays like that. The boy felt a flicker of hope, though it was quickly tempered by the realization of just how much danger they were in. He had to protect the dog. He had to keep her safe. But as they approached the door, the girl suddenly grabbed his arm, pulling him back into the shadows. Sure, she whispered urgently, pressing a finger to her lips. The boy's heart skipped a beat. What now? From the corner of the street, a figure emerged. The boy's stomach dropped when he saw who it was. The man, the one who had hurt the dog, was standing just a few feet away, his eyes scanning the street, his expression dark and focused. The girl pressed the boy back against the wall, her hand clamped over his mouth to stifle any sound. They both held their breath, not daring to make a sound. The boy's heart raced, and he could feel the dog's small, fragile body trembling in his arms. The man's gaze swept across the street, his eyes narrowing as he came closer. He's looking for us, the boy whispered through clenched teeth. The girl nodded, her grip tightening on him as she pulled him further into the shadows. They couldn't afford to make a sound, couldn't afford to be seen. Every second felt like an eternity as the boy's mind raced. If the man found them now, it was over. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and the boy could hear the man muttering to himself. I know she's around here somewhere. I'll find her. His voice was low, but there was no mistaking the anger in it. The boy's breath itched, and he silently begged the universe to keep them hidden, to keep them safe for just a little longer. He had no idea how they were going to get out of this situation, but one thing was clear: this wasn't just a random encounter. The man had been hunting the dog, and now, it seemed, he was hunting them both. The girl's eyes locked onto his, a silent message passing between them. Stay still. Be quiet. Keep the dogs safe. But the boy couldn't stop his mind from racing. What if the man found them? What if there was no escape? What if the girl couldn't help them? The air felt heavy with tension, thick with the sound of their hearts pounding in unison. Every breath the boy took seemed to echo in his ears, louder than the man's footsteps. The girl beside him was frozen, her hands still covering his mouth, but her eyes were wide, scanning the street ahead. Every few seconds the boy's gaze flickered to the dog, who was still trembling in his arms, oblivious to the danger. Her soft, frightened whimpers only made the boy's anxiety grow. He had to keep her safe. He had to protect her at all costs. The man was getting closer now, his shadow stretching across the street as he muttered to himself, the words too low to make out. But the tone was unmistakable. He was furious. The boy could see his breath fogging in the cold night air as he scoured every corner, every shadow, like a predator hunting its prey. Where are you? The man grumbled, his voice a growl as he moved past their hiding spot. The boy held his breath, barely able to stay still. His muscles were stiff from fear, but he knew better than to move. He could feel the girl's grip tightening on his arm, her silent plea for him to stay calm and quiet. They couldn't afford to make a sound. The smallest noise could give them away. The boy's thoughts raced. What now? What would happen if the man found them? He didn't know where the girl's safe place was, but it felt like their only hope. He had no idea how long they could stay hidden, though. His heart was thudding so loudly he feared the man could hear it. And the dog, her tiny body was like a ticking time bomb, ready to explode with fear at any moment. If she made a sound, everything would be over. The man was almost right on top of them now, and the boy could see the edge of his silhouette as he paced back and forth, just a few feet away. His eyes were scanning every crevice of the street. The boy could almost feel the weight of his gaze, like man could see right through the walls of the alleyway. The girl's eyes locked onto the boy's. She looked terrified, but there was something else in her eyes: determination. She wasn't going to let the man find them. She wasn't going to let this dog go back to the abuse. The boy could see the resolve in her expression, but he could also see how close the danger was. The man's anger was palpable, and there was no doubt in the boy's mind that he would stop at nothing to get what he wanted. The minutes felt like hours, each one stretching painfully as the boy watched the man move closer and closer, almost brushing against their hiding place. The girl's hand was still over his mouth, and the boy's body was rigid, every muscle screaming to move, to act, but he had to stay still. And then, just when he thought they couldn't get any closer to being discovered, the man stopped. Right in front of their hiding spot. The boy's breath caught in his throat. The seconds seemed to stretch out into an eternity. The man had stopped right where they were hidden. He was so close that the boy could feel his presence, like the air had thickened around him. The man's footsteps had stilled, and the silence that followed was deafening. It was as if the world had paused, holding its breath. The girl squeezed the boy's arm, her eyes wide with fear, and the boy's heart skipped a beat. Was he going to look right at them? Could he hear the soft sound of their breathing, the rustling of the dog's fur? Would the man turn and see them, standing there in the shadows? Then, just as the boy thought he couldn't take it any longer, the man grunted, muttering under his breath. He turned, his silhouette shrinking as he walked away, further down the street. It wasn't much, but the boy couldn't believe his luck. The man was moving on, his focus shifting elsewhere. For a moment, the boy didn't move, still clutching the dog in his arms as if she might vanish if he let go. The girl slowly pulled her hand away from his mouth, both of them listening intently to make sure the danger had passed. The air around them was thick with the tension that had built up over those long, excruciating minutes. The boy exhaled shakily, his breath a quiet sigh of relief. It wasn't over, not yet, but they had bought themselves some time. His mind was still reeling, and he wasn't sure how much longer they could keep running. The girl didn't waste any time. Without a word, she grabbed his arm again and started pulling him toward the building she had pointed out earlier. They moved quickly, keeping their steps light and fast, not daring to look back. The boy felt his pulse racing again as they neared the shelter. They were close, so close, but he couldn't shake the feeling that danger was still lurking. When they reached the door, the girl knocked quickly, twice, then once more, her eyes scanning the street behind them. The boy was too anxious to process anything else. All he could think about was getting inside and getting the dog to safety. The door opened just a crack, and a pair of eyes peered out, then widened when they saw the girl and the boy standing there, drenched from the rain. "What's going on?" the woman asked, her voice hushed but sharp with concern. She glanced quickly at the dog in the boy's arms, her eyes softening when she saw the poor animal's condition. "It's the dog," the girl said quickly, her voice tight with urgency. "We need to get her inside now." The woman stepped aside without another word, holding the door open for them to slip inside. The boy walked in first, feeling a slight sense of relief as he crossed the threshold. He looked back just once, making sure they weren't being followed, but the street was empty now. The man was gone for the moment. As the door clicked shut behind them, the boy let out a breath he didn't realize he had been holding. The shelter was warm and quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos outside. The dog was still in his arms, but her trembling had lessened, and the boy allowed himself to relax just a little. But the girl wasn't done yet. "We need to stay low," she said, her voice a little less urgent but still tense. "The man's not going to give up easily. He'll be looking for her." The boy nodded, but his mind was still racing. He couldn't shake the image of the man's furious face, the anger that burned behind his eyes. It wasn't over. They were safe for now, but they still had no idea what kind of trouble they were really in. The warmth of the shelter offered only temporary relief, a fleeting sense of safety that the boy quickly realized couldn't last forever. The girl was pacing near the door, her eyes flicking to the window every few seconds, as though waiting for something or someone to appear. The boy set the dog down gently on a soft mat they'd been given, watching her curl up in exhaustion, her tiny body still trembling. He couldn't shake the image of the man's angry face, or the sense that they had narrowly escaped something much worse. "What now?" he asked quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. He turned to the girl, his stomach in knots. They were safe, but only for the moment. The girl didn't answer immediately. She was lost in thought, biting her lip as her eyes darted around the room. Then, without warning, she turned to face him. "I'm going to need you to trust me," she said, her voice low but resolute. There was a glint of something in her eyes, a determination, but also a flicker of fear. "We can't stay here long. It's not safe." The boy's heart skipped a beat. He didn't fully understand, but there was something in the girl's expression that made him take her seriously. He nodded slowly, though he didn't have the slightest clue what she meant by not safe. They had just managed to get away from the man, so why would they be at risk here? Before he could ask, the girl walked over to the corner of the room where an old-looking phone sat. She picked it up with trembling hands and dialed a number, her fingers moving with surprising speed. The boy could hear the phone ring in the silence, the seconds dragging on endlessly. Then the girl spoke in hushed tones, her words urgent. "Get her out. Now. It's happening sooner than we thought." The boy was frozen in place, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was she talking about the dog? Who was she calling, and why was there a sense of impending danger that hadn't been there just a moment ago? The girl's face was pale, and for the first time, the boy saw the true weight of the situation pressing down on her. She hung up quickly and turned to him, her eyes filled with anxiety. "They've found us," she said, her voice shaking. "He's not just a man looking for a dog. He's part of something much bigger. Something dangerous." The boy's mind raced, trying to process what she was saying. "Who's they? What do you mean?" But the girl wasn't looking at him anymore. Her gaze had shifted to the window, where the soft glow of streetlights illuminated the empty streets. The wind outside had picked up, rattling the windows and sending a chill through the room. She took a deep breath before speaking again, as though steeling herself for what she was about to reveal. "There's a network of people," she explained, her words clipped. "They've been running a kind of underground operation. They exploit animals like that dog, use them for things you wouldn't want to imagine. They call themselves the Watchers, and they're everywhere." The boy's stomach dropped as the weight of her words hit him. The man they had just escaped from wasn't a random abuser then. He was part of something far more sinister. The girl continued, her voice trembling slightly. "The Watchers don't just want the dog, they want every dog in the city. They're controlling everything, every street, every corner. And now they know she's here." A cold chill ran down the boy's spine. The room suddenly felt too small, too enclosed. How had it all gotten so complicated so quickly? A part of him wanted to run, to take the girl and the dog and escape to some faraway place, but there was nowhere to go. Nowhere to hide. He opened his mouth to speak, but before he could ask anything, the sound of a car engine revving outside made him jump. His heart skipped a beat, and the girl's eyes widened in recognition. "That's them," she whispered, barely audible. "They've already found us." The boy rushed to the window, his pulse pounding in his ears. There, parked under the flickering streetlight, was a black van. The engine hummed as the lights went out, casting the street into darkness. The boy could see shadows moving within the vehicle, and his breath caught in his throat. They had to get out fast. But just as they began to move, the door to the shelter opened. The boy whirled around, his eyes wide in shock, to see the woman who had let them inside standing in the doorway. She had a look of panic on her face, but her voice was calm, low, as she quickly spoke. "You need to leave. Now. They're here, and they're coming for you." The girl turned to the boy, her eyes full of fear but also something else, resolve. "We have to go," she said urgently. "Now." The boy nodded, his thoughts swirling. There was no more time to think. He grabbed the dog and rushed toward the back of the shelter, his legs moving faster than they ever had before. The girl was right behind him, her breath coming in short, frantic bursts. They reached the alley just as the first sound of footsteps echoed in the hallway behind them. The girl glanced back once, her eyes filled with dread, before she pulled the boy further into the darkness. With every step, the weight of situation pressed heavier on him. There was no escaping it now. They were deep in this mess, and there was only one thing left to do: survive. The girl stopped suddenly, pulling him into a narrow space between two buildings. She glanced over her shoulder again, making sure they weren't being followed. The boy could feel adrenaline coursing through his veins, making everything seem sharper, more vivid. But as the girl looked around the corner cautiously, her face suddenly froze. The boy's heart stopped in his chest. Ahead, standing at the end of the alley, was the man. He was leaning against a wall, his arms crossed. And right next to him, standing like he belonged there, was someone else. Another member of the Watchers. The girl's grip on his arm tightened, and for the first time, the boy felt the true depth of the danger they were in. They couldn't outrun them. They couldn't fight them off. The Watchers had them trapped. The boy's mind raced, his heart hammering in his chest. The only question now was, how were they going to get out of this alive? The boy's heart raced in his chest as he stared at the two figures ahead. The alley felt narrower now, suffocating in its silence. The girl's grip on his arm tightened, her body stiff with fear, but she didn't let go. Every instinct told him to run, but there was nowhere to go. The man from earlier, the one they had barely escaped, stood at the end of the alley, blocking their only path. His face was grim, but there was no surprise in his eyes. He had expected them. And next to him, the second figure, another watcher, had a cruel smile on his face, the kind that made the boy's skin crawl. "You really thought you could outrun us?" the first man said, his voice low and cold, carrying through the night air. "This is over. Hand over the dog, and maybe we'll let you go." "Maybe." The girl's hand slipped into her jacket pocket, and for a moment, the boy thought she was reaching for something, perhaps a weapon, or a plan to escape. But when she spoke, her voice was steady, almost too calm given the situation. "We're not giving her up," she said firmly. The boy could feel the resolve in her words, but it did little to calm the storm brewing inside him. He wanted to believe they could fight their way out of this, but the odds were stacked against them. The Watchers had the numbers, the power, and the control. They had been tracking the dog for a reason, and now it was clear that she wasn't just another stray. She was part of something much bigger. The second Watcher stepped forward, his eyes narrowing as he took in the dog still huddled in the boy's arms. "You think you're protecting her, but you don't know what you're dealing with. She's already marked." His smile widened, as though he found their attempt to protect the dog almost laughable. The boy's mind was spinning. "What does that even mean? Why is she so important to you?" he demanded, his voice shaking. The man shook his head, his expression darkening. "That's not for you to know. Just hand her over, and this can end." But the girl stepped forward, her stance unwavering. "No," she said, her voice colder now. "She's not going anywhere with you." The boy looked at her, confused. "What are you talking about? We can't fight them. There's no way." The girl didn't even look at him as she pulled something from her pocket. It gleamed in the dim light, a small, inconspicuous device, no larger than a coin. She pressed it into his hand and whispered, "This will give us a way out. Trust me." He looked at the device in confusion, his mind still racing, but the girl didn't wait for him to respond. With a swift motion, she turned back to the two Watchers, her face hardening. "You won't take her. Not today. Not ever." Before the boy could react, the girl pressed the device into a hidden panel on the side of the alley, and suddenly, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The boy stumbled, barely catching his balance, as the walls of the alley seemed to shift. For a moment, it felt like the world was twisting around him. The Watcher's eyes widened in surprise as the alley floor split open, revealing a hidden underground passage. It was too fast, too sudden. They hadn't expected it. The girl grabbed the boy's arm and yanked him toward the opening just as the man lunged forward. But the boy wasn't fast enough. He felt a rough hand grab his shoulder, yanking him back. In a flash of panic, the boy instinctively swung his elbow, catching the man off guard. He broke free, pushing himself toward the opening. The girl was already inside, holding out her hand to him. He took it without thinking, pulling himself into the narrow passageway just as the sound of footsteps and shouts echoed behind them. They sprinted through the passage, the sound of the Watcher's pursuit growing distant. The boy's mind was racing, adrenaline coursing through his veins, but the girl didn't slow. She led him through the darkness, her confidence unwavering despite the chaos. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small underground room barely large enough to stand in, with low-hanging pipes and flickering lights. The boy collapsed against the wall, gasping for breath. The girl, too, leaned against the opposite wall, her chest heaving. But her eyes were alert, scanning every corner of the room. "We're not safe yet," she muttered. "They'll figure out where we are." The boy looked at her in confusion, still trying to process everything. What is all this? How did you? I'd been tracking them for weeks, she said without looking up. The Watchers aren't just a random group of thugs. They're organized. The boy's pulse quickened as he began to realize what she was saying. What do you mean? She turned the screen toward him, revealing a map of the city with several marked locations. At the center of the map was a large building, the same one the boy had seen when he first ran into the man. But this time, there were new details. Hidden rooms, secret entrances, and more names than he could count. The Watchers' network was far more extensive than they had imagined. But you're not alone, she continued, her voice low. There are others, people who've been working against them from the inside. They want to stop them, just like we do. The boy stared at the screen, the weight of the situation sinking in. So what now? How do we stop them? The girl's eyes hardened with determination. We take the fight to them. We expose them for what they are. And we make sure they never hurt anyone again. But just as she said this, a strange noise echoed from the far end of the room, faint but unmistakable. The sound of footsteps. Someone was coming. The boy's heart skipped a beat. Who? Before he could finish, the door slammed open, and standing in the doorway was someone neither of them expected to see. A figure, silhouetted by the dim light, wearing the unmistakable garb of a Watcher. But it wasn't one of the men they had been running from. It was someone they thought they had left behind. Someone they trusted. The twist was clear now. They were never as safe as they thought. And their fight was far from over. As the door swung open, the boy's heart nearly stopped. Standing there, in the dim glow of the underground room, was the one person they had never expected to see again, a figure they had both known, trusted, and thought they had left behind. His familiar face was framed by the faint light from the hallway, his expression unreadable. The boy's breath caught in his throat. What are you doing here? The girl demanded, stepping between the boy and the newcomer, her voice sharp and defensive. Her posture was tense, ready for a confrontation she hadn't anticipated. The man in the doorway hesitated, his eyes shifting between the two of them. The boy's mind raced, trying to make sense of the situation. The man looked different now, haggard, worn down, as if the weight of something heavy had finally caught up with him. He wasn't wearing the usual Watcher uniform. Instead, he was dressed simply, as though he had been living on the run, just like they had. I didn't think you'd be this far gone, the man said quietly, his voice tinged with regret. He looked at the dog in the boy's arms, the animal that had sparked this whole journey. I thought you were just kids trying to play hero. But you're deeper in it than I ever expected. The boy felt a mix of anger and confusion surge within him. What do you mean deeper in it? We've been running for our lives. We've seen what they're capable of. You left us behind. The man lowered his gaze, a shadow crossing his face. I know. But I was trying to protect you. I didn't want you to be part of this, not after everything you've already been through. The girl's eyes narrowed. You left us to deal with them on our own. How could you protect us by abandoning us? I didn't have a choice, the man said softly. The Watchers, they're not just a gang. They've been controlling things for years. I've been working for them, and I got out when I realized what they were really doing. But I couldn't come back for you. Not until I knew I had a plan. The boy's head was spinning. A plan? What kind of plan? The man stepped into the room, his movements slow and deliberate. A plan to stop the Watchers for good. To expose them and bring everything they've been doing into the light. The girl stepped back, lowering her guard just slightly. You really think you can do that? After everything that's happened? The man nodded grimly. It's going to take more than just us. We need help. We need people who've been living in the shadows, working against the Watchers from the inside. People who know their every move. The boy glanced at the girl, his mind racing. He didn't know what to believe anymore. Everything they had fought for, everything they had risked, felt like it was unraveling right before his eyes. They had been so certain of what they were doing, so sure that their path was the right one. And now, this man, the one they had trusted and thought they'd lost, was offering a way out, but it came with a heavy price. "Why should we trust you?" the boy finally asked. "After everything? After you left us?" "I don't expect you to trust me," man replied, his voice full of regret. "But you're not alone in this fight anymore. We all have a common enemy now, and that's something we can work with. I came back because you're part of something bigger than you think. And it's time we end it." The tension in the room was thick, and for a long moment, neither the boy nor the girl spoke. The air seemed charged with uncertainty, each of them weighing the man's words. Finally, it was the girl who broke the silence. "Okay," she said, her voice steady, though there was an edge to it. "We'll hear you out. But if you've got another agenda, or if this is just another trick..." The man raised his hands in a gesture of peace. "I'm done with tricks. I'm done with the Watchers. You can check the files I've gathered, see the intel I've compiled. If you still want to walk away after that, I'll leave. But I'm here to stop them. With you. All of us." The boy exchanged a look with the girl, who seemed to have made up her mind. After a long, heavy silence, she nodded. "Show us." They followed him to another hidden room in the underground complex, where rows of old computer monitors flickered with information. The man went straight to one of the computers and began typing furiously, pulling up files, images, and data streams that painted a disturbing picture. It was clear now just how deep the Watchers' control ran. They weren't just a criminal network. They had infiltrated government systems, corporations, even local communities. Everything they had done, the manipulation, the lies, the brutality, was designed to keep the truth buried. The girl leaned over the man's shoulder, reading the information as it scrolled past. "This is bigger than we thought," she murmured. The boy felt the same way. He had always known the Watchers were dangerous, but seeing everything laid out before him, seeing the full extent of their operation, was more than he had ever imagined. The dog, who had been at the center of it all, wasn't just a victim. She was a key to unraveling everything. But even as the man spoke, detailing his plan to expose the Watchers, something in the boy's gut told him that they weren't out of danger yet. There was more to this story. More to what the dog represented. More to the man's return. And just as the boy was about to ask more questions, there was a loud noise from the hallway, a crash, followed by the sound of shouting voices. The man's face went pale. "They've found us." The girl's expression hardened. "We need to move. Now." They didn't have time to argue. The boy barely had time to grab the dog before the man led them through another passageway, this one even more hidden than the last. The girl's quick thinking and the man's knowledge of the underground system kept them ahead of the Watchers, but the closer they got to the exit, the more the boy realized how deep the danger truly was. They weren't just running from thugs anymore. They were running from an entire system. A system built on lies, control, and cruelty. And now, they were caught in the middle of it. Just when it seemed like they might escape, another twist came. The boy felt a sharp tug at his arm, and before he could react, a voice called out, "Stop right there." He turned to see two Watchers blocking their exit. The man who had been helping them stood frozen, his face pale. "I knew this was a trap," the boy muttered, his voice thick with disbelief. "No," the man said, turning to face them. "No, it wasn't supposed to be like this." But the sound of a gunshot cut him off. The girl stepped forward, blocking the boy from the blast. Her body jerked back, but she didn't fall. Instead, she lunged at the nearest watcher, grabbing his arm and twisting it behind him, forcing him to drop the weapon. "Go!" she yelled at the boy. "Run!" He didn't need to be told twice. The boy ran, clutching the dog tightly against his chest. But as he looked back, he saw the man standing in the doorway, watching them with a conflicted look. He wanted to help, but there was something dark in his eyes now. A decision had been made. The boy ran faster. But just as he reached the final hallway, a hand grabbed his arm and yanked him into the shadows. It was the girl. "We're not done yet," she whispered urgently. "Not until the watchers are gone for good." And so, they disappeared into the night, determined to finish what they had started. The boy, now understanding the full weight of what they were up against, couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Their fight was far from over. But in his heart, he knew one thing for sure: they weren't alone anymore. And they wouldn't stop fighting until the truth was exposed, until the watchers could no longer hurt anyone again. With the dog by their side, they stepped into the unknown, ready to bring the fight to the ones who had tried to control them. And together, they would make sure that no one else would ever have to live in fear again.